The Arizona sun did not bargain with anyone. It burned the weak and hardened the strong, turning the red clay of the earth into a dusty mirror of the hellfire preachers warned about on Sundays. It was the year 1875, a time when the territory was still bleeding from the edges, somewhere between the law of the gun and the law of the gavel. Silver Mesa was not much of a town to the eyes of a stranger, just a collection of timber and adobe huddled against the vast, indifferent spine of the mountains. But for the men who sought gold or grazing land, it was the center of the world. Clara Beaumont stood on the porch of her father's ranch house, shielding her eyes against the glare. At 19 years of age, she was a contradiction that Silver Mesa did not quite know how to handle. Her skin was fair, protected by wide-brimmed hats and parasols as her late mother had insisted, but her eyes held the color of the ironwood leaves, dark and resilient. She wore a dress of pale blue muslin, imported all the way from St. Louis, with lace at the collar that scratched her throat. It was a beautiful cage. She often thought, a cage of whalebone and silk designed to keep her soft, to keep her contained, to keep her ready for a husband. Behind her, the heavy oak door creaked open. Henry Beaumont stepped out, his boots striking the wood with the heavy, confident rhythm of a man who owned everything he could see. He was a large man, broadened by decades of wrestling cattle and fighting the elements, his face a map of deep lines etched by wind and worry. "Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You should be inside. The dust is picking up. Luke will be here by 6 o'clock for supper. I want you to look fresh, not windblown like a field hand." Clara lowered her hand but did not turn immediately. She looked out toward the eastern ridge, where the purple shadows were beginning to stretch across the valley floor. Somewhere out there, beyond the safety of the fences and the patrols, was the Apache land, the unknown. "I am not a field hand, Father," she said softly, turning to face him. "But I am not a porcelain doll either. I was just watching the horizon." Henry sighed, pulling a silver watch from his vest pocket. He glanced at the face of the timepiece. "It is 5:30. Go and wash up. Luke has important news. He says the railroad contracts are nearly finished, this union between our families. Clara, it is not just about a wedding. It is about the future of this valley." Clara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. It was always about the valley. It was always about the cattle, the water rights, and the railroad. She was merely the ribbon tied around the deed. She walked past her father into the house, the cool air of the adobe interior offering little relief from the heat rising in her chest. The house was filled with heavy furniture brought from the east, dark mahogany that looked brooding against the white plaster walls. It was a museum of a life she was supposed to want. Later that evening, the dining room was lit by the warm glow of kerosene lamps. The table was set with the good china, the plates painted with delicate roses that had never seen a desert. Luke Caro sat opposite Clara, slicing into a steak with a precision that unsettled her. Luke was 10 years her senior, a handsome man in the way a predator is handsome. He had slick dark hair, a mustache that he waxed daily, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was the son of the second largest landowner in the territory, and in his mind, merging the Caro and Beaumont herds was manifest destiny. "The beef is excellent, Henry," Luke said, pausing to wipe his mouth with a linen napkin, "but not as excellent as the company." He directed his gaze at Clara. She felt it like a physical touch, heavy and possessive. He did not look at her with curiosity. He looked at her with inventory. He was counting her teeth, checking her gait, ensuring she was sound stock. "Thank you." "Luke," Clara said, forcing the words past her lips. "I heard troubling news in town today," Henry said, pouring himself a glass of red wine. "Another wagon was hit near the southern pass. 3 men dead. They say it was Apaches." Luke nodded, his expression darkening into a performance of outrage. "It is that devil Nantan. They say he moves like a ghost. One moment the desert is empty, the next moment your throat is cut, the army is useless. Captain Doyle sits in his fort polishing his buttons while that savage runs wild." Clara looked up. She had heard the name, Nantan. in the whispers of the washing women and the drunken boasts of the ranch hands. Nantan was less a man and more a spirit of vengeance. They said he had lost his entire family in a raid 5 years ago, and now he lived only to bleed the white man dry. But Clara had also heard other things. She had heard that he never killed women or children. She had heard that he only attacked the supply wagons carrying ammunition, not the ones carrying food. "Are we certain it was Apaches?" Clara asked. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the heavy air of the room. Both men stopped eating. Luke looked at her with a patronizing tilt of his head. "My dear Clara," Luke said, a smirk playing on his lips. "Who else would it be? They are animals. They see the railroad coming, and they know their time is ending. They are lashing out, but old man Miller said the arrows found at the last site were fletched with crow feathers." Clara persisted, her heart beating faster. "He told the sheriff that this tribe uses hawk feathers, and the tracks. He said the horses were shod." "Apache horses are unshod, are they not?" Henry slammed his hand down on the table, making the silverware jump. "That is enough. Clara, do not speak of things you do not understand. Old Miller has been drinking moonshine since 1862. He sees pink elephants in the cactus." Luke reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. His palm was damp, and his grip was too tight. "Your father is right. Clara, these are matters for men. You need not worry your pretty head about savages. Once we are married, I will make sure the range is safe. I have a plan to clear those mountains once and for all." Clara pulled her hand away, pretending to reach for her water glass. The word married hung in the air like smoke. After dinner, the men retired to the study for cigars and brandy. Clara was expected to sit in the parlor and embroider, but the walls felt like they were closing in on her. She excused herself, claiming a headache, and went to her room. But she did not sleep. She changed out of the blue muslin and into a simple riding skirt and a cotton shirt, items she had hidden in the back of her wardrobe. She pulled on her boots, the leather worn and soft, quietly, like a shadow in her own home. She slipped out the back door. The night air was cool, a sharp contrast to the day. The moon was a sliver of bone in the sky, providing just enough light to see the path to the stables. Her horse, a roan mare named Rusty, nickered softly as she approached, but Clara hushed her with a gentle hand on her velvet nose. She saddled the mare quickly, her hands deft and sure. This was the only time Clara felt real, not when she was pouring tea, not when she was reciting poetry, but when she was tightening a cinch and smelling the scent of hay and horse sweat. She rode out of the ranch gate, keeping to the shadows of the cottonwood trees until she was well clear of the bunkhouse. Then she let Rusty run. They flew across the desert floor, the wind whipping Clara's hair loose from its pins. She rode west, toward the jagged spine of the red rocks that the locals called the Devil's Fingers. Most people avoided the area. The terrain was treacherous, full of box canyons and rattlesnakes. But Clara knew a secret. Deep within the twisting labyrinth of stone, there was a hidden valley. And in that valley, fed by an underground spring that never ran dry, was a lake. It took an hour of hard riding to reach the entrance to the canyon. Clara slowed Rusty to a walk, navigating the narrow trail that wound between towering walls of sandstone. The moonlight could barely reach the bottom here, but Clara knew the way by heart. She had found this place 2 years ago, chasing a stray calf, and it had become her sanctuary. When the canyon finally opened up, the sight always took her breath away. The lake lay like a black mirror, perfectly still, reflecting the stars that burned with an intensity only seen in the desert. The water was framed by tall grasses and willow trees, a shocking green against the endless red and brown of the wasteland. Clara dismounted and tied Rusty to a low branch. She walked to the water's edge, her boots sinking into the soft mud. The silence here was not empty. It was full. It was full of the sound of crickets, the rustle of the wind in the willows, and the distant hoot of an owl. It was the sound of a world that did not care about stock prices or railroads or social standing. She sat on a large, flat rock that jutted out into the water. Slowly, she began to unbutton her shirt. She peeled off the layers of her civilization, the riding skirt, the heavy stockings, the chemise. She stopped only when she was in her thin white undergarments. She shivered, not from cold, but from the sheer weight of the freedom. She dipped her toes into the water. It was cold, a shock that traveled up her spine and woke every nerve ending. This was who she was. Not Clara Beaumont, the rancher's daughter. Not the future Mrs. Luke Caro. She was just a creature of flesh and blood, alone under the vast sky. She thought of what Luke had said at dinner. "I have a plan to clear those mountains." The way he said it, with such casual cruelty, made her blood run cold. They were talking about people, families, even if they were Apaches, even if they were the enemy. The idea of wiping them out like a pestilence sickened her. She waded deeper into the lake, the water rising to her waist. She floated on her back, looking up at the Milky Way, which stretched across the heavens like a river of diamond dust. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a different life, a life where she could choose, a life where her value was not measured in acres of land or head of cattle. She stayed in the water for a long time, washing away the dust of the town, the smell of Luke's cigar smoke, and the suffocating expectations of her father. When she finally emerged, dripping and shivering, she felt cleansed. She dried herself with a rough blanket she kept in her saddlebag and dressed quickly. The ride back was slower. The euphoria of the lake faded as the lights of the ranch house came into view. The reality of her life was waiting for her, solid and immovable as the mountains. When she returned the horse to the stable and crept back toward the house, she saw that the light in her father's study was still burning. The window was open to let in the night breeze, and voices drifted out into the yard. Clara stopped, pressing herself against the rough adobe wall, hidden by the shadows of the rose bushes. She knew she should go to bed. Eavesdropping was unladylike. It was dishonest, but the tone of the voices held her there. "It is risky." Luke, her father, was saying. His voice sounded tired, stripped of its earlier bluster. "If the army finds out we are provoking them, the army will do what they always do." Luke's voice cut in, sharp and dismissive. "They will react. Captain Doyle is a fool, but he is a predictable fool. If he thinks Nantan has attacked a settlement, he will ride out in force. He will not ask questions about who fired the first shot. But the supply train next week." Henry hesitated. "That is government property." "Exactly," Luke said. "And when it burns, Washington will scream for blood. They will send more troops. They will drive the Apache out of the eastern range entirely. And that land, Henry, that land is prime grazing. Plus, the railroad survey needs the pass clear. The value of your northern pasture will triple overnight." Clara covered her mouth with her hand to stifle a gasp. It was not just prejudice. It was not just fear. It was a business transaction. They were planning to stage an attack, to burn a government supply train, and frame the Apaches to incite a war, all for grass and gold. "And what about Clara?" Henry asked. "Does she suspect anything?" She asked sharp questions at dinner. Luke laughed, a dry, ugly sound. "Clara is a child. She reads too many novels. She has a soft heart. But once she is my wife, I will curb that. She will be busy with children and running the house. She will forget all about noble savages and justice. We will announce the engagement in 2 weeks at the Founders' Ball. By then, the Eastern Range will be ours." Clara felt the bile rise in her throat. She backed away slowly, terrified that a twig might snap under her boot. "Once she is my wife, I will curb that." He spoke of her as if she were a horse to be broken. She fled to her room, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She threw herself onto her bed, burying her face in the pillow to muffle her jagged breathing. The sanctuary of the lake felt 1,000 miles away. The walls of her room were no longer just plaster and wood. They were the bars of a prison cell. 2 weeks. She had 14 days before the trap snapped shut. 14 days before she was sold to a man who planned to start a war for profit. The next morning, the town of Silver Mesa seemed different to her. The sunlight looked harsh, exposing the cracks in the walls and the dirt in the streets. Clara rode into town with her father. who insisted she needed to visit the dressmaker for the ball. As the buggy rattled down the main street, Clara looked at the faces of the people, the shopkeepers sweeping their boardwalks, the women carrying baskets of eggs, the men leaning against the posts of the saloon. They were good people, mostly. They feared the Apaches because they had been told to fear them. They did not know they were pawns in a game played by men like Luke Caro. While her father went to the bank, Clara walked toward the mercantile. A group of men were gathered near the water trough, their voices loud and angry. "I tell you, I saw him," one man shouted, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "He was up on the ridge near Twisted Creek, looking down at us like a wolf watching a flock of sheep." "It was Nantan," another man agreed, nodding grimly. "He is scouting for a raid. Mark my words, before the moon is full, there will be blood on the ground." Clara paused, gripping her parasol tighter. Twisted Creek was miles to the north, nowhere near where Luke had said the attacks were happening. If Nantan was there, he was far from the wagon roads. She looked at the men, seeing the genuine fear in their eyes. They believed the lie because it was easier than the truth. It was easier to believe in a savage monster than to believe that their own leaders were the monsters. She stepped into the mercantile, the bell above the door jingling cheerfully. The scent of coffee beans and calico fabric hit her, a familiar comfort that now felt hollow. She moved to the counter, pretending to examine a spool of ribbon. Her mind was racing. What could she do? She was one woman, 19 years old, with no money of her own and no authority. If she told the sheriff, he would laugh at her or go straight to Luke. If she told the army commander, Captain Doyle, he would likely not believe her over a prominent citizen like Luke Caro. She felt a profound sense of isolation. She was alone in a town full of people. That afternoon, she returned to the ranch, the dread sitting heavy on her shoulders. She sought solace in the library, trying to read, but the words swam on the page. She kept hearing Luke's voice. "I will curb that." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, Clara went out to the corral. She needed to see Rusty. She needed to feel the warm, living presence of the horse, the only creature that did not expect anything from her. She was brushing the mare's flank when she heard the sound of approaching riders. She peered through the slats of the fence. It was Luke, accompanied by 3 men she did not recognize. They were rough-looking men, their dusters stained and their hats pulled low. They did not look like ranch hands. They looked like hired guns. Luke dismounted and spoke to her father on the porch. Clara could not hear the words, but she saw her father nod. His posture slumped and defeated. He handed Luke a heavy leather pouch. Money, or perhaps maps. The strangers rode off toward the east, toward the mountains, toward the Apache land. Clara realized with a jolt of terror that the timeline might have moved up. They were not waiting for the ball. Whatever they were planning, the wheels were already turning. She looked at the darkening horizon. Somewhere out there, among the rocks and the cactus, was the man they called Nantan. He was the villain in their story. The boogeyman used to frighten children, but in Clara's mind, a dangerous thought was taking root. If Luke was the liar, then what was Nantan? If the civilized men were the savages, then perhaps the savage was something else entirely. She remembered the feeling of the water in the hidden lake, the feeling of stripping away the layers of pretense. She realized that she could not stay in the house and wait for her fate to arrive. She could not be the porcelain doll in the cabinet, but she also knew that leaving the ranch now, with Luke's men patrolling the roads, was madness. She needed a plan. She needed courage. That night, lying in her bed, staring at the ceiling, Clara made a silent vow. She would not be sold. She would not be silent. And if she had to ride into the very jaws of hell to stop this war, she would do it. She did not know yet that her sanctuary, her secret lake, was about to become the intersection of her 2 worlds. She did not know that the blood she feared would be found in the water where she sought peace. The wind howled outside the adobe walls, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. It whispered against the glass of her window, a sound like a voice trying to tell her something. It was the voice of the desert, ancient and unforgiving. "Tomorrow," she told herself. Tomorrow. I will go back to the lake. I need to think. I need to breathe. She closed her eyes, but sleep was a stranger. In the darkness, she saw the red mountains burning, and she saw a pair of eyes she had never met, dark, intense, and full of a sorrow she was just beginning to understand. The clock in the hall chimed midnight. The day was done. But the story of Clara Beaumont was only just beginning, and the path ahead was paved not with gold, but with sharp stones and shattered illusions. She was a virgin to the world's true cruelty, but the desert was a harsh teacher, and the lesson was about to begin. The dawn broke over the eastern ridge like a bruised plum, spilling shades of violet and deep indigo across the sleeping desert. The air held a biting chill, the kind that seeped into the bones before the sun had a chance to assert its tyranny. Clara Beaumont did not wait for the light. She had spent the night staring at the ceiling of her bedroom, the wood grain becoming a map of her entrapment, until the silence of the house became unbearable. She saddled Rusty with hands that trembled, not from the cold, but from a residual vibration of anger and fear. The conversation she had overheard between her father and Luke, Caro replayed in her mind, a discordant loop of betrayal. They spoke of land and blood as if they were trading sacks of flour. As she urged the mare out of the stable and into the open scrub, Clara felt the first true breath of the morning fill her lungs. She rode hard, pushing the horse and herself away from the ranch house, away from the impending engagement, away from the lies that constituted her reality. The dust kicked up by Rusty's hooves swirled behind them, a temporary veil between Clara and the world she was desperate to escape. The entrance to the hidden canyon was a fissure in the earth, a jagged scar in the red sandstone that looked impassable from a distance. Clara guided Rusty through the narrow twists and turns, the walls rising so high they blotted out the expanding sky. When the trail finally widened, the scent of the air changed. The dry, dusty smell of sagebrush gave way to something sweeter, damper. It was the smell of life. The lake lay before her, a sheet of glass undisturbed by the wind. It was framed by cottonwoods and willows, their roots drinking deep from the underground spring that fed this oasis. Clara dismounted, her boots sinking into the soft, mossy earth of the bank. She tied Rusty to a low branch and walked to the water's edge. Here, in this cathedral of stone and water, the title of Miss Beaumont dissolved. She was not the daughter of a wealthy rancher. She was not the future wife of a man she despised. She sat on a large, flat rock that jutted out over the deep water and began to unlace her boots. She peeled off her stockings, rolling them carefully and placing them inside her shoes. When her bare feet touched the water, the cold was a shock that traveled straight to her heart. It was a clean, sharp sensation. She closed her eyes, tilting her head back to feel the first rays of the sun touching her face. For a moment, she was simply a creature of the earth, existing without expectation or duty. She opened her eyes and looked down at the water, watching small fish dart among the shadows of the rocks. Then she saw it. It was not a shadow. It was not a submerged leaf. It was a ribbon of crimson, unfurling slowly in the crystal current like smoke. Clara froze. The tranquility of the morning shattered. She watched the red swirl drift closer to the bank, thickening as it came. Blood. Fresh blood. Her first instinct was to pull her feet from the water and run to her horse. The desert was a dangerous place, and blood meant a predator was nearby. A mountain lion, perhaps, or a wolf. But the amount of blood suggested something large, or someone. Curiosity, that dangerous trait her mother had always warned her about, warred with her fear. Clara stood up, her bare feet gripping the cool rock. She looked upstream, toward the cluster of boulders at the far end of the lake where the spring bubbled up from the earth. The red trail seemed to originate from there. She moved slowly, stepping from stone to stone, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The silence of the canyon now felt heavy, pregnant with a threat she could not see. She reached into the deep pocket of her riding skirt and wrapped her fingers around the cold pearl handle of the Derringer pistol her father had given her. It was a small weapon, barely more than a toy, but it offered a sliver of comfort. Clara rounded the largest boulder. Her breath caught in her throat. He was there. A man sat slumped against the sandstone wall, half in and half out of the water. He was not a cowboy. He was not a drifter. He wore leggings of buckskin and a shirt of calico that was dark with moisture and blood. His hair was long and black, unbound and falling over his face. It was Nantan. Clara recognized him instantly from the descriptions whispered in town, though seeing him in the flesh was vastly different from the monstrous caricatures drawn by fearful men. He was younger than she expected, perhaps only a few years older than herself, with high cheekbones and a jawline that looked carved from the same granite as the canyon walls. He was clutching his left shoulder, where the fabric of his shirt was torn and sodden with red. Clara gasped, the sound too loud in the stillness. Nantan's head snapped up. His eyes were dark obsidian, sharp and alert despite his injury. In a movement that was terrifyingly fast, his right hand snatched a long knife from the sheath at his waist. Clara jerked the derringer from her pocket and leveled it at him with both hands. Her arms shook violently. "Do not move," she commanded, her voice thin and wavering. They froze in a tableau of potential violence. The white girl with her shaking gun, and the Apache warrior with his knife, bleeding into the water that was supposed to be a sanctuary. Nantan did not lunge. He did not shout. He simply looked at her, his gaze traveling from the gun to her face. He assessed her with a terrifying calm. He saw the fear in her wide eyes, but he also saw that she had not fired yet. "If you shoot," he said, his voice a low rasp that sounded like gravel grinding together, "every coyote and patrol in 5 miles will hear." His English was heavily accented, the words chopped and hard, but clear. Clara tightened her grip on the trigger. "Who are you?" she asked, though she already knew. "Put the gun down, girl," Nantan said. He grimaced, pain flashing across his face as he shifted his weight. "If you shoot, they come, they kill me, but they find you here with me. What do they do to you then?" The logic struck Clara harder than a physical blow. She knew exactly what would happen. If Luke's men or the army found her here, alone with an Apache warrior, her reputation would be destroyed. Worse, in the heat of bloodlust, they might not distinguish between an enemy and a bystander. Or perhaps the man before her would simply throw that knife before she could pull the heavy trigger. "Why are you here?" Clara asked, lowering the gun by an inch but keeping it ready. "You are hurt." Nantan looked at his shoulder, then back at her. "A bullet," he said simply. "Your people are poor shots, but they have many guns." Clara stared at the wound. It was deep, the flesh torn and angry. It was a bullet wound, just as he said. The realization washed over her with the force of a cold wave. The rumors of skirmishes were true, but here was the proof that it was not a one-sided aggression by savages. He had been shot, likely while retreating or defending, given the angle. She looked into his eyes again. She expected to see the soulless evil that the preacher spoke of. She expected to see the animalistic rage Luke warned her about. Instead, she saw pain. She saw exhaustion. And beneath it all, she saw a fierce, burning intelligence. He was watching her not as a predator watches prey, but as a man watches a storm, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Something shifted inside Clara. It was the same feeling she had when she looked at the horizon, the feeling that the world was vast and she had been living in a very small box. "This is my land," Nantan said softly, almost to himself. "The water does not belong to the ranch." He lowered the knife slowly, placing it on the flat rock beside him. It was an offering, a gamble. Clara lowered the gun. She engaged the safety mechanism with a trembling thumb and slid it back into her pocket. She was insane. She knew she was insane. This man was the enemy of her father, the enemy of her fiancé, the enemy of her entire world. But he was bleeding to death in front of her. She stepped closer, her bare feet making no sound on the stone. "I have nothing to bandage it with," she said. Nantan watched her approach, his muscles tensed, ready to spring if she made a false move. But he remained seated. He nodded toward her skirt. "Cotton," he said. "It stops the blood." Clara looked down at her white petticoat peeking out from under the hem of her riding skirt. Without hesitating, she grabbed the delicate fabric and ripped a long strip from the bottom. The sound of tearing cloth was loud. Shocking! She knelt beside him. Up close, he smelled of wood smoke, pine resin, and the metallic tang of blood. He radiated a heat that was intense, almost feverish. "This will hurt," she warned him. "Do it," he said through gritted teeth. Clara reached out. It was the first time she had ever touched a man who was not a relative, other than the unwanted, possessive grips of Luke Caro. Nantan's skin was dark copper, smooth over hard muscle, but slick with sweat. As she pressed the pad of folded cotton against the wound, his entire body jerked, rigid as iron, but he did not make a sound. He did not cry out. He only inhaled sharply through his nose, his eyes squeezing shut for a second. Clara worked quickly, winding the long strip of cloth around his shoulder and under his arm to secure the pad. Her hands, usually so careful with needlepoint, were now covered in his blood. It was warm and sticky. It terrified her, and yet it made her feel incredibly alive. When she finished, she sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on her skirt. She looked at his face. He was watching her again. The hostility had receded, replaced by a profound curiosity. Why, he asked. Clara blinked. Why what? Why do you not run? Why do you help? You are white. I am Apache. We are enemies. Clara looked at the bloody water swirling around his legs. Because you are bleeding, she said, her voice steady now. And because I am tired of doing what I am told. A corner of Nantan's mouth twitched, almost a smile, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He leaned his head back against the rock, his breathing shallow. You are the daughter of the big ranch house. Beaumont. Clara went cold. You know who I am. I know all the enemies. Nantan said. I watch. I see you ride sometimes. You ride fast, like you want to get away from your own shadow. Clara felt exposed. This stranger had seen her in her most private moments, racing across the plains. He understood her desperation better than the man she was supposed to marry. Suddenly, Nantan's head snapped toward the canyon entrance. His body went rigid. Silence. He hissed. Clara listened. At first, she heard nothing but the wind in the willows. Then, she felt it, a vibration in the ground, the rhythmic thudding of hooves. Many horses, moving fast. They are coming, Nantan said. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled. He groaned, gripping the rock for support. Clara scrambled to her feet, panic seizing her throat. Who is coming? The blue coats, Nantan said, and men with dusters. They track the blood. Clara looked toward the narrow trail. If the soldiers found her here, with her hands stained with Apache blood and her petticoat torn to bind his wounds, there would be no explanation that could save her. She would be branded a traitor. Her father would be ruined. And Luke would likely kill Nantan right in front of her. You have to hide, Clara whispered frantically. Get into the reeds. I will distract them. No, Nantan said firmly. He forced himself to stand, swaying slightly. They track well. They will see your footprints next to mine. They will see the blood on your dress. They will ask why you are here. The sound of the horses grew louder. Voices echoed off the canyon walls, rough, shouting voices. Clara recognized one of them. It was the foreman of Luke's ranch, a man named Silas, who enjoyed shooting coyotes for sport. There is a horse in the brush, Silas shouted. A roan mare. Someone is here. Clara turned to Nantan, terror wide in her eyes. It is my horse. They found Rusty. Nantan looked at her, and in that split second, a decision formed behind his black eyes. It was a hard choice, a warrior's choice. He could leave her to face them, and they might harm her for being near him, or they might use her to flush him out. Or he could take the only path that ensured his survival and, paradoxically, kept her from being implicated as a willing accomplice. He reached out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was not gentle this time. It was iron. Come, he commanded. What? No! Clara tried to pull back. I cannot go with you if you stay. You die, or they destroy you, Nantan growled. pulling her toward the dense thicket of willows where she knew a narrow game trail led up the back of the canyon. If you are with me, they will think I took you. They will not shoot at you. It buys us time. He was going to kidnap her. He was going to use her as a shield, but he was framing it as a rescue. Or perhaps it was both. Let me go. Clara cried, but her struggle was half-hearted. She could hear the men crashing through the brush near the entrance. They were seconds away. Nantan whistled, a sharp, piercing sound that mimicked a hawk. From the shadows of the far trees, a paint horse emerged, its coat streaked with mud to blend in with the rocks. It trotted to him, eyes rolling. Nantan swung himself onto the horse's back with a grunt of agony, ignoring the fresh blood that bloomed on the white bandage. He did not let go of Clara's wrist. He hauled her up. Clara scrambled, finding purchase on the horse's flank, and Nantan pulled her up behind him. "Hold tight," he ordered. Before she could protest, before she could think about the madness of what she was doing, Nantan kicked the horse's ribs. The animal lunged forward, not toward the entrance, but toward a steep, crumbling slope at the rear of the canyon that looked impossible to climb. As they scrabbled up the loose scree, stones clattering down behind them, a shout erupted from below. There on the ridge, he has the girl. A gunshot cracked the air. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. A bullet whined off the rock face a foot to their left. Clara buried her face in Nantan's back. The smell of him, smoke, blood, and sweat filled her nose. She wrapped her arms around his waist, holding on for her life. More shots rang out, but they were already cresting the ridge. The paint horse, sure-footed as a mountain goat, leaped over the crest and plunged into the maze of rocks on the other side. They were flying now, descending into a labyrinth of stone where the shadows were deep and cool. Clara looked back once, her hair whipping across her face. The lake was gone. The ranch was gone. Her life as Clara Beaumont was gone. She was no longer the rancher's daughter. She was the captive of the Apache. And as the wind roared in her ears, she realized with a terrifying clarity that for the first time in her life, she was riding away from the cage, not toward it. Nantan did not speak. He rode with a single-minded intensity, navigating the treacherous terrain as if he were born of the rock itself. But Clara could feel the tension in his body, the tremor of pain that ran through him with every gallop. He had saved her from the questions of the posse. Yes, but he had also bound her to him. They rode deeper into the wilderness, leaving civilization behind with every stride of the galloping horse. The sun climbed higher, indifferent to the girl and the warrior who had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The inciting incident was over. The journey had begun. The heat of the afternoon sun was a physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders of the two riders as they navigated the labyrinth of the red rocks. The paint horse was strong, but carrying double weight through the treacherous terrain was taking its toll. Its breathing was labored, a rhythmic huffing that mixed with the sound of shod hooves striking stone. Clara Beaumont held onto Nantan's waist, her face pressed against the rough buckskin of his shirt. She could feel the heat of his skin beneath the leather, a dry, feverish warmth that worried her. The bandage she had improvised was holding, but she could see fresh blood seeping through the white cotton, a stark reminder that their escape had come at a price. They were moving deeper into the Badlands, away from Silver Mesa, away from the army patrols, and away from the life Clara had known for 19 years. Every mile they put between themselves and the ranch felt like a layer of skin being peeled away. Nantan pulled the horse to a halt beneath the overhang of a massive sandstone arch. The shade offered a brief respite from the merciless glare of the sun. He slid off the horse first, his landing heavy and ungraceful, a testament to his pain. He reached up, his hand calloused and firm, to help Clara down. "We rest here," he said, his voice tight. "The horse needs water. I need to stop the bleeding." Clara landed on the dusty ground, her legs trembling from the long ride. She looked at him, really looked at him, in the harsh light of day. He was exhausted, his face drawn, lines of pain etched around his mouth. Yet, his eyes remained constantly moving, scanning the horizon, the ridge, the shadows. "Why are they hunting you?" Clara asked. She needed to know. The question had been burning in her throat since they fled the canyon. Not the lies the town tells, the truth. Nantan moved to the horse, pouring a small amount of water from a skin bag into his cupped hand for the animal to drink. He did not look at her immediately. "They hunt because it is easier to kill a dog than to admit you stole his bone," Nantan said. He turned to her, wiping his hand on his leggings. "Your father's friends. The man called Luke. They say I raid the wagons. They say I kill the drivers. And do you?" Clara asked, her voice steady despite her fear. Nantan's eyes flashed with a cold fire. "I kill soldiers who come to my village. I kill men who try to take my sisters. But I do not burn wagons of food. I do not kill unarmed men for sport." He stepped closer, the intensity of his presence forcing Clara to hold her ground. "2 nights ago, I tracked the raiders. I saw them. They wore moccasins. Yes, they wore headbands. Yes, but they spoke English. They had white skin under the dust. And when they finished burning the wagon, they rode back toward Silver Mesa, toward the Caro Ranch." Clara felt the breath leave her lungs. It was exactly what she had feared, exactly what the fragments of conversation between her father and Luke had suggested. But hearing it from Nantan, seeing the raw honesty in his face, made the betrayal solid and heavy as a stone. "They are pretending to be you," Clara whispered. "To give the army a reason to wipe you out?" Nantan nodded once. "Luke wants the Eastern Valley. He wants the water. He cannot take it while the Apache live. So he makes us monsters. And the army comes to kill monsters." Clara leaned back against the cool rock wall, feeling sick. Luke Caro was not just a greedy cattleman. He was a murderer. And her father was, at best, a coward who looked the other way, and at worst, a silent partner in the slaughter. "I heard them," Clara admitted, her voice trembling. "Luke and my father. They talked about expanding the range, about clearing the mountains." Nantan looked at her, his expression softening slightly. "Then you know why I could not leave you there, if you know their secret. You are dangerous to them, even if you are his daughter." The reality of her situation settled over her. She was not just a runaway bride. She was a witness to a conspiracy. If she went back now, Luke would never let her speak. She was trapped in the wilderness with a man her world called a savage. Yet he was the only one telling her the truth. "We must move," Nantan said, breaking the silence. "The wind is changing. The sky turns yellow." Clara looked out past the arch. The horizon, previously a sharp line of blue and red, was disappearing into a haze of bruised ochre. The air had grown heavy and still. The birds had gone silent. "A sandstorm," she said, recognizing the signs from her childhood. "It comes fast," Nantan said. He struggled to mount the horse again, gritting his teeth. They rode for another hour, but the storm moved faster than the tired horse. The wind began to pick up, screaming through the canyons like a chorus of lost souls. Sand stung their faces, sharp as needles. The sky darkened until it felt like twilight at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. "We cannot outrun it," Nantan shouted over the roar of the wind. He steered the horse toward a narrow fissure in the canyon wall, a deep crevice that offered shelter from the main force of the gale. They dismounted hurriedly. Nantan pulled the horse deep into the crack of the rock, forcing it to kneel. He pulled a heavy wool blanket from his saddle roll and threw it over Clara and himself as they huddled against the stone wall. The world outside disappeared. There was only the howling wind, the darkness, and the heat of Nantan's body next to hers. They were pressed together by necessity, shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip. Clara could feel the rapid beat of his heart against her arm. For hours, the storm raged. The sand piled up around their boots. In the confined space, the boundaries of their worlds blurred. She was not a Beaumont here. She was just a body seeking warmth and safety. He was not an Apache warrior. He was a man protecting a woman from the elements. Nantan shifted, wincing. His shoulder was bleeding again. "Lean on me," Clara said, her voice muffled by the blanket. "I am fine," he muttered, his pride evident even in the dark. "Do not be foolish," Clara scolded gently. "If you pass out, I cannot lift you." He hesitated, then slowly allowed his weight to rest against her. It was a surrender, a small admission of vulnerability. Clara reached out in the darkness and found his hand. It was rough, scarred, but his fingers did not pull away. She held his hand, not out of romance, but out of a desperate need for human connection in the face of nature's fury. When the wind finally died down, night had fallen. The silence that followed the storm was absolute. They dug themselves out of the drift, shaking the red dust from their clothes and hair. The moon had risen, full and bright, illuminating a landscape that had been scrubbed clean. They were thirsty. Their throats were parched, coated in grit. The horse nickered softly, smelling water. "We are close," Nantan said, his voice raspy. "Close to what? To the water?" We circled back. Clara realized with a start that they had navigated a wide arc through the Badlands. They were approaching the hidden lake, but from the western side, a side she had never explored. It was a rugged, rocky approach that led down a steep slope. They led the horse down carefully. When the lake came into view, reflecting the moonlight like a pool of mercury, Clara felt tears prick her eyes. It was still there, her sanctuary, unchanged by the violence of the day. They set up a makeshift camp in a grove of cottonwoods, far from the main trail where the posse had been. Nantan tended to the horse first, wiping its eyes and nostrils with a damp cloth before allowing it to drink. Only then did he drink himself. Clara sat by the water's edge. She felt filthy. The dust of the storm was matted in her hair, caked on her skin, and inside her clothes. She felt the grime of the lies she had been living, the stain of Luke's touch on her hand at dinner, the dust of the run. She needed to be clean. She needed to wash away Clara Beaumont so she could see who was left underneath. "Nantan," she said. Standing up, she pointed to the water. "I need to bathe." Nantan looked up from where he was checking his knife. He nodded once. "Understanding the need?" "The water's cold," he said, "but it cleans the spirit. I need you to keep watch," she said, feeling a sudden flush of heat that had nothing to do with the desert. "But turn your back, please." Nantan stood. He walked to a high rock about 20 yards away, a vantage point that overlooked the approach to the cove but gave him a view of the lake as well. He turned his back to the water, facing the dark desert. "I will watch the land," he said. "You are safe." Clara waited a moment, watching his silhouette against the stars. He stood still as a statue, a guardian carved from the night itself. She turned to the water, quickly, shedding her inhibitions along with her clothes. She stripped, the riding skirt, the shirt, the dust-choked undergarments. She left them in a pile on the stones. She walked into the lake. The water was icy, stealing the breath from her lungs, but it was a welcome shock. It felt like a baptism. She scrubbed her skin with handfuls of sand, washing away the sweat and the fear. She dipped her head under, letting her long hair float out around her like a halo of seaweed. For the first time in her life, she was entirely, terrifyingly free. There were no walls, no corset, no father telling her to sit straight, no Luke looking at her with ownership. There was only the moon, the water, and the man standing guard on the rock. She stood waist-deep in the water, looking at Nantan's back. He had kept his word. He had not turned, but the intimacy of the moment hung heavy in the air. He knew she was naked. He knew she was vulnerable, and he had chosen to protect that vulnerability rather than exploit it. Suddenly, a coyote howled in the distance, a sharp, laughing sound. Nantan turned instinctively, his hand going to his knife, scanning the perimeter. His gaze swept across the shoreline and, for a heartbeat, settled on the lake. His eyes met hers. Clara did not scream. She did not cover herself in a panic of Victorian modesty. She stood still, the water lapping at her waist, her skin pale as marble in the moonlight. She saw him look at her, in his eyes. She did not see the lust she saw in Luke. She did not see the appraisal of a merchant. She saw a profound recognition. He saw her, not the rancher's daughter, but the woman, the survivor. He looked at her with a fierce, solemn respect that shook her to her core. It was a look that whispered of danger, yes, but also of a deep, ancient connection. He turned back to the desert slowly, giving her privacy again, but the connection remained, a taut string between them. Clara waded out of the water, shivering now as the night air hit her wet skin. She wrapped herself in the second blanket Nantan had laid out on a log. She dried her hair as best she could and dressed in her clothes, which she had shaken free of dust. She walked up to where Nantan stood. He heard her approach and turned. He looked at her face, scrubbed clean and pale, her eyes dark and wide. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a strip of dried meat, offering it to her. She took it, their fingers brushing. "You are cold," he said. "I am fine," she answered, though her teeth wanted to chatter. Nantan looked at the lake, then back at her. His voice dropped, becoming low and resonant, carrying the weight of the stone and the sky. "In my tribe," he said, "the old women say that a person has two lives, the life they are given and the life they choose." Clara wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I think I left the life I was given back at the ranch." Nantan nodded. He stepped closer, the distance between them closing until she could feel the heat radiating from him again. He looked down at her, his eyes searching hers. "To be out here, alone, without the walls of your father's house, it is dangerous, but it is true." He gestured to the vast, star-filled sky above them, a dome of infinite possibility. "You are afraid," he stated. "Not a question." "Yes," Clara admitted. "I'm afraid of what happens tomorrow. I'm afraid of what they will say about me, that I am ruined, that I have spent the night with you." Nantan's expression hardened slightly, but not with anger, with resolve. "They will say you are lost," he said, "but you are not lost." He reached out and touched the edge of the blanket near her shoulder. It was a light touch, barely there, but it sent a shockwave through her. "Tonight," he said, his voice a rough whisper that blended with the wind in the cottonwoods. "There are no walls. There is no Luke. There is no father. There is only the earth and the sky." He looked deep into her eyes, holding her gaze with an intensity that made her knees weak. "This night, your first night of freedom, is yours. It does not belong to the man who wants to buy you. It does not belong to the father who wants to sell you." He paused, searching for the right words in the foreign tongue. "Your first night is mine to guard. If you sleep, I watch. If you wake, I am here. No hand touches you unless you bid it." Clara felt a lump rise in her throat. The phrase, "your first night is mine," echoed in her mind, but stripped of all predatory meaning. It was an offering of service. It was a declaration of protection. He was giving her ownership of herself by promising that no one, not even he, would infringe upon it. "Thank you," she whispered. She looked at him, at the blood seeping through his bandage, at the weariness in his stance. "Let me change your dressing," she said softly, "before we sleep." They sat by the small fire Nantan had built in a hollow of rocks to hide the light. Clara carefully washed his wound with clean water and bound it with a fresh strip of cloth from her petticoat. The intimacy of the act was different now. It was not just first aid. It was a ritual of care. She touched the skin of his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. She realized with a jolt that she was attracted to him, not just gratitude, but a physical pull toward his strength, his quiet dignity. It was a terrifying realization for a girl raised to believe that men like him were soulless heathens. Nantan watched her work, his eyes tracing the line of her jaw, the curve of her neck. He, too, was fighting a battle. He had sworn to hate all white faces for what the soldiers had done to his family. But this face was full of courage and compassion. She was the daughter of his enemy. Yet she had saved his life. When the bandage was done, they sat on opposite sides of the fire. The flames crackled, casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls. Clara lay down on the hard ground, pulling the blanket up to her chin. She watched Nantan through the flames. He sat cross-legged, his rifle across his lap, staring into the dark. He was the sentinel at the gate of her new life. "Nantan," she said softly. "Sleep, Clara," he replied without turning. "The morning brings hard choices." Clara closed her eyes. For the first time in weeks, the knot of anxiety in her chest loosened. She was sleeping on the ground, hunted by her own people, in the company of a killer. And yet, she felt safer than she ever had in her feather bed at the ranch. The night deepened. The stars wheeled overhead, silent witnesses to the strange alliance formed in the dust. Clara drifted into sleep, her dreams no longer of cages, but of open skies and dark eyes that saw her true self. Nantan did not sleep. He fed the fire, stick by stick. He listened to the breathing of the white girl. He thought of the war that was coming, the blood that would be spilled. He knew that by bringing her here, he had complicated everything. But as he watched the firelight play on her sleeping face, he knew he would not change it. She was the first night. She was the beginning of something he could not yet name, but he would defend it with his last breath. The rising action had only just begun, and the fire in the canyon was nothing compared to the fire that was beginning to burn between them. The ride to the edge of the Apache territory was a journey into a world that Clara had been told did not exist. She had been raised on stories of barren wastelands inhabited by ghosts and monsters. But as Nantan guided the paint horse through a high pass and into a hidden valley, she saw only life. The land here was green, fed by snowmelt from the higher peaks. There were stands of ponderosa pine that smelled of vanilla and sun-baked needles, and the air was thin and sharp. They approached the encampment slowly. It was not a chaotic gathering of savages as the dime novels described, but an orderly arrangement of wickiups blended seamlessly into the landscape. Smoke drifted lazily from cooking fires, carrying the scent of roasted meat and sage. As they rode in, the silence rippled outward from their arrival. Conversations stopped. Children who had been playing a game with sticks and hoops froze, staring with wide, dark eyes. Women paused in their weaving and grinding of corn, their hands still, their gazes hardening as they saw the white woman seated behind their warrior. Nantan could feel the tension in Clara's body, the way she stiffened against his back. "Do not look down," he murmured. "Look at them. Show no fear." Clara lifted her chin. She met the stares of the women. She expected to see hatred, and she found it. But she also saw curiosity and fear. They looked at her not just as an intruder, but as a harbinger of the soldiers who burned winter stores and killed without mercy. Nantan stopped the horse in the center of the camp. A group of men approached. They were not young warriors like Nantan. These were the elders and the veterans. Men with faces like tanned leather and eyes that had seen too much death. One of them, a man with hair the color of iron and a scar running from his temple to his jaw, stepped forward. He looked at Nantan's bandaged shoulder, then at Clara. "You bring a storm with you." "Nantan," the man said. His voice was deep, resonant, and he spoke in the Apache tongue. But Nantan translated quietly for Clara. "I bring the truth," Nantan replied. He swung down from the horse, wincing as his feet hit the ground, then turned to help Clara down. The older man, whose name translated to Greyhawk, stepped closer to Clara. He did not touch her, but his scrutiny felt like a physical weight. "Why is the daughter of the rancher here? Does she come to count our numbers for the blue coats?" "She comes because she saved my life," Nantan said, his voice hard. "And because she knows the lies her people tell." A murmur went through the crowd. A woman stepped forward, holding a bowl of water. She looked at the blood on Nantan's shirt and then at the torn hem of Clara's dress. She said nothing, but she offered the bowl to Clara first. Clara hesitated, then took it. "Thank you," she said softly. The woman nodded once, a brief flicker of acknowledgement, before turning to tend to Nantan. For the next 2 days, Clara lived in a state of suspended reality. Nantan was taken to a medicine lodge to have his wound properly cleaned and treated with poultices of bear root and sage. Clara was given a small shelter at the edge of the circle. She was not a prisoner, but she was not a guest. She was a curiosity. She watched them. She saw a mother singing to a fussing baby, the melody soft and universal. She saw young men racing horses, laughing with the same bravado as the boys in Silver Mesa. She saw the elders sitting by the fire, passing a pipe and speaking of the seasons and the herds. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. They were just people. They were families trying to survive on the land of their ancestors. The monster she had been taught to fear was a myth invented to justify theft. The cruelty she had heard about was real, but she began to understand it was a reaction to invasion, not an inherent nature. On the third morning, a scout rode into the camp. His horse was covered in foam, its sides heaving. He shouted for the elders before his feet even touched the ground. Nantan, his shoulder now bound in clean linen and leather, emerged from the lodge. He signaled for Clara to come. She needs to hear this, he told Greyhawk. The scout, a young man named Swift Fox, looked at Clara with distrust but spoke rapidly to Nantan. I tracked the wagon burners, Swift Fox said, breathing hard. They struck again yesterday. A supply train near the southern pass. 4 drivers dead. Did you see their faces? Nantan asked. Swift Fox nodded grimly. I watched from the high ridge. They wore our clothes. They painted their faces. They whooped and screamed like they think we do. But when the killing was done, they rode to the dry creek bed. I saw them wipe the paint off. I saw them laugh. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Who were they? Greyhawk asked. Swift Fox spat on the ground. One was the man with the silver spurs. The one who rides the black stallion. Luke, Clara whispered. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. The scout looked at her. Yeah, and the others were men I have seen at the Beaumont Ranch. The silence that followed was heavy with rage. The warriors around the circle gripped their weapons. This was the proof they had suspected but never seen. It was a false flag, an orchestrated theater of violence designed to bring the hammer of the United States Army down on their heads. Greyhawk looked at Clara. His eyes were no longer hostile, but filled with a terrible sorrow. Your father's men do this. They wear our skin to commit their sins. Clara stepped forward. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was clear. My father. He is weak, but Luke Caro is the one doing this. He wants the Eastern Valley for the railroad. He needs the army to clear you out so he can claim the land. She looked around the circle of faces. If you attack the town now, if you retaliate for this wagon train, you play right into his hands. That is what he wants. He wants a war. He wants Captain Doyle to bring the cannons. Nantan stepped beside her. She is right. If we ride out now, we die, and the land is lost forever. Then what do we do? Swift Fox asked. We cannot let them butcher us in our sleep. We use their own weapon against them, Nantan said. He looked at Clara. We have a witness. Clara felt the weight of every gaze land on her. She knew what he was asking. It was a terrifying prospect. To go back to the wolf's den, to look Luke in the eye and pretend to be his loving fiancé while holding a knife behind her back. I have to go back, Clara said. The words hung in the air. If I stay here, I am just a missing girl, a victim. But if I go back, if I tell them I escaped, I can find out when the big attack is coming. I can find the proof Captain Doyle needs to arrest Luke. It is dangerous, Greyhawk warned. If this man Luke suspects you know, he will silence you. I know, Clara said. She looked at Nantan. But it is the only way to stop the war. The plan was formed in the dust of the Apache camp. Clara would return to Silver Mesa on foot, disheveled and exhausted. She would claim that Nantan had taken her, but that she had slipped away during the sandstorm. It was a lie that protected Nantan's honor. He would be seen as a kidnapper. Yes, but not a killer, and it gave Clara the perfect cover. Nantan and a select group of warriors would move to the hidden canyons near the town. They would wait for Clara's signal, a mirror flash from the ridge indicating when and where Luke planned to strike the army or the final blow against the tribe. Before she left, Nantan took her to the edge of the valley, near a small stream that fed into the river below. It was midday, and the sun turned the water into a ribbon of gold. They stood apart, the social distance of their two worlds trying to reassert itself. But the memory of the night in the canyon, the shared heat under the blanket, was a palpable current between them. "You do not have to do this," Nantan said quietly. "You could ride north. Go to the city. Be safe." Clara shook her head. "And leave you to die. Leave my father to become a monster. No." She looked down at her hands. They were scratched and tanned, no longer the hands of a porcelain doll. "When I met you at the lake," she said, "I wanted to run away. I thought freedom was just leaving, but now I know that freedom is choosing what you fight for." Nantan stepped closer. He reached out and took her hand. His grip was warm and solid. It was the first time he had touched her without the necessity of survival. It was a touch of choice. "If we survive this," Nantan said, looking at the horizon, "the world will still try to keep us apart. They will say water and fire cannot mix." Clara looked up at him, her eyes fierce. "Let them say it. I am done listening to what they say." She squeezed his hand. "If we survive this, Nantan, I want to decide my own life. And I think I want my life to have you in it." He did not kiss her. It was too dangerous, too soon, and perhaps too small a gesture for the magnitude of what lay between them. Instead, he pulled her into a brief, crushing embrace. He smelled of pine and leather and the earth itself. For a moment, Clara closed her eyes and imprinted the feel of him onto her soul. "Go," he whispered. "Run like the wind. Clara Beaumont." Clara walked the last 5 miles to Silver Mesa. She tore her sleeve on a mesquite bush purposefully. She rubbed dust into her face. By the time the outlying buildings of the town came into view, she looked like a woman who had walked through hell. A ranch hand spotted her first. He shouted, waving his hat, "Miss Clara, it is Miss Clara. She is alive." The cry went up like a flare. People poured out of the buildings. Henry Beaumont came running from the sheriff's office, his face pale and aged by days of worry. "Clara, oh, God." "Clara," he caught her as she feigned a stumble. He wept openly, hugging her tightly. "I thought I had lost you. I thought that savage had killed you." Clara buried her face in his shoulder, but her eyes remained dry and open, scanning the crowd. "I escaped. Father," she rasped, her voice perfectly pitched to sound weak. "The storm. He lost the horses. I ran." Then Luke pushed through the crowd. He looked impeccable in a dark suit, but there was a tightness around his eyes that Clara had never noticed before. He did not look relieved. He looked calculating. "Clara," he said, reaching for her. "You are safe." He took her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Did he hurt you? Did he touch you?" Clara looked at him. She saw the monster beneath the silk vest. She saw the man who burned wagons and killed innocent men to increase his profit margin. "No," she lied, pulling her arm back slightly. "He wanted a hostage. He thought he could trade me for the land. But I got away." Luke studied her face, searching for a crack in her story. For a second, the air between them crackled with suspicion. Then, he smoothed his expression into a mask of concern. "You are brave, my dear. Incredibly brave. We will make him pay for this. Captain Doyle is already mustering the cavalry. We will wipe every one of them off the face of the earth." Clara let her father lead her toward the carriage. The town was buzzing with the news. The return of the white woman was the spark the powder keg needed. Men were cleaning their rifles. Women were looking toward the mountains with hate in their eyes. "I need to rest," Clara said, leaning back against the leather seat of the buggy. "Of course," Henry said, patting her hand. "We will take you home. Dr. Thompson will see you." As they rode out toward the ranch, Clara closed her eyes, but she did not rest. She listened. Luke was riding beside the buggy on his black stallion. He was talking to Henry. "It changes nothing." "Henry," Luke said, his voice low enough that he thought Clara could not hear over the rattle of the wheels. "In fact, it makes it better. The savages kidnapped a white woman. The army has no choice now. We attack at dawn on Thursday. Thursday. 2 days." Clara kept her breathing even, pretending to be asleep. "Thursday. That night, the Beaumont Ranch was a fortress. Armed men patrolled the perimeter. Clara was confined to her room. For her safety, Luke had insisted. She lay in her bed, the clean sheets feeling foreign against her skin. She missed the rough wool of the Apache blanket. She missed the silence of the canyon. She got up and moved to the window. The moon was rising, the same moon that shone on Nantan and his warriors waiting in the dark. She had to get the signal to them. But the house was surrounded. Luke had placed his own men at the doors, ostensibly to guard her, but Clara knew they were there to keep her in. She began to search her room. She needed a mirror. She needed a way to reflect the sun when it rose. But more than that, she needed information. She needed to know exactly where the attack would happen. The dawn on Thursday was not enough. The mountains were vast. If the army went to the wrong canyon, Nantan's ambush would fail, and the village would be defenseless. The door handle turned. Clara jumped back into bed, pulling the covers up. It was her father. He carried a tray with soup and bread. He looked diminished, a man eaten alive by his own compromises. "Clara," he said, setting the tray down. "I am so sorry. I should have protected you better." Clara sat up. "Father," she said, "testing the waters. Why is Luke so eager for this war?" Henry sighed, sitting heavily in the chair by the window. "It is complicated. Clara, the world is changing. The railroad brings progress, but it demands order. Luke believes he is bringing order." "By killing people?" Clara asked. "By dressing his men up as Indians to burn wagons?" Henry froze. The spoon he had been holding clattered onto the tray. "Who told you that?" he whispered. Clara saw the truth in his eyes. He knew. He had known all along. "I saw them." "Father." She lied, pressing her advantage. "When I was running away, I saw white men washing paint off their faces. I saw Silas." Henry put his head in his hands. "It has gone too far. I told him no more killing. But he says it is the only way to secure the contract." He looked up at her, his eyes pleading. "You must never say that to anyone else. Clara, Luke, he is a dangerous man. If he thinks you know, I cannot protect you." "Then help me stop him," Clara said, reaching for his hand. "I cannot," Henry whispered. "I am in too deep. I owe the bank. I owe Luke." He stood up, defeated. "Eat your soup. Clara, we will announce the engagement officially at the victory dinner on Friday." He left the room, locking the door from the outside. The click of the lock was the sound of her father's final betrayal. Clara sat in the dark. Her father was useless. She was alone in the house of the enemy. But she was not the same girl who had left this room days ago. She went to the wardrobe and pulled out the small mirror she used for her hair. She hid it under her mattress. Then she went to the loose floorboard in the corner of the room, the one she had used as a child to hide her diary. She pulled it up. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, was the spare set of keys to the gun cabinet she had stolen years ago on a dare. Thursday. She had one day to find out the location of the attack, one day to signal Nantan, one day to turn the tide of history in Silver Mesa. Clara Beaumont smiled in the darkness. It was a cold, hard smile. Luke Caro thought he had captured a dove. He was about to find out he had locked a hawk in his cage. The town of Silver Mesa buzzed with the frantic, jagged energy of a kicked hornet's nest. The news of the Apache kidnapping and Clara's miraculous escape had spread through the dusty streets like wildfire, igniting old hatreds and new fears. Men who usually spent their afternoons dozing on the porch of the general store were now oiling rifles and sharpening bowie knives. The air smelled of gun oil, stale beer, and the copper tang of bloodlust. Luke Caro stood on the raised wooden platform in front of the sheriff's office, a man transformed by the spotlight. He wore a crisp, dark suit, his silver spurs gleaming in the harsh afternoon sun. Beside him stood Captain Doyle, a stiff man in a blue uniform with gold buttons that strained against his chest. Doyle looked serious, the weight of military authority heavy on his shoulders. But Luke looked triumphant. "We move at dawn," Luke bellowed, his voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. "For too long, we have lived in the shadow of the savage. They steal our cattle, they burn our wagons, and now they dare to touch our women." A roar of approval went up from the gathered men. Clara stood on the periphery, her arm linked through her father's. She wore a high-collared dress that concealed the scratches on her neck, but nothing could hide the cold knot of dread in her stomach. She watched Luke, seeing him not as a fiancé, but as a predator finally closing its jaws around its prey. "The Army will lead the charge," Captain Doyle announced, stepping forward. "We have credible intelligence that the renegade Nantan is hiding in Echo Canyon. We will flush them out. Any Apache found with a weapon will be treated as a combatant." Clara tightened her grip on her father's arm. Echo Canyon. That was the wrong location. Nantan was not in Echo Canyon. He was in the Spider Rock Labyrinth to the west. But Luke had steered them to Echo Canyon because that was where a peaceful family group of Apaches was currently camped for the harvest. It would be a slaughter of innocents, a massacre to seal the war. As the crowd began to disperse, breaking into groups to check ammunition and supplies, Clara saw Luke lean in close to Captain Doyle. She feigned a coughing fit, pulling her father closer to the platform so she could hear. "Are you sure the evidence is in place?" Doyle asked in a low voice, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Washington will want proof that they struck first. Do not worry." "Captain," Luke whispered, a serpentine smile playing on his lips. "My men found a cavalry jacket in their camp last week, and if we need more, well, a few arrows and a dead horse look the same regardless of who shot them. We will make the report watertight." Clara felt a chill that defied the heat of the day. It was not just a battle. It was a staged execution. Luke was not just going to kill Apaches. He was going to frame them in their graves. That night, the moon rose large and yellow, a hunter's moon. The Beaumont ranch was quiet, though the tension vibrated in the walls. Her father had retired early, drowning his conscience in whiskey. The guards Luke had posted were still there, but they were distracted, drinking coffee and boasting about the violence tomorrow would bring. Clara slipped out of her window. She had greased the hinges earlier with lard from the kitchen. She moved like a ghost across the veranda, avoiding the creaky floorboards she had memorized as a child. She did not head for the stables. Taking a horse would make too much noise. Instead, she crept toward the low rise of land just beyond the windmill, a place where the earth humped up like the back of a sleeping giant. She reached the mound, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She pulled the small hand mirror from the pocket of her skirt. Her hands were shaking. If Nantan was not watching, if he had been forced to move, if the signal failed, everything would be lost. She angled the mirror toward the western ridge, catching the moonlight. One long flash, two short, one long. She waited. The desert silence was absolute. A coyote yipped in the distance. The wind rustled the dry mesquite. "Please," she whispered to the empty dark. "Please be there." Then, from the jagged silhouette of the western rocks, a tiny spark of light answered. One long, two short, one long. He was there. He knew. Clara signaled again. A specific sequence they had agreed upon, 3 quick flashes to indicate danger, followed by a sweeping arc to the east, Echo Canyon. The light on the ridge blinked once, a solid, steady confirmation, and then vanished. Clara lowered the mirror, pressing it against her chest. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm. The pieces were moving. The trap was set, but she did not know whose jaw it would snap shut on. The march began 3 hours before dawn. The column of riders stretched like a dark snake across the valley floor. Captain Doyle rode at the front, flanked by Luke and his hired guns. Clara rode beside her father near the rear, her face pale and set. She had insisted on coming, telling Luke that she needed to see the end of her nightmare to find peace. Luke, arrogant in his victory, had agreed, thinking it would break her spirit completely and make her pliable for marriage. They reached the mouth of Echo Canyon as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the red rocks in shades of violent crimson. The canyon was narrow, a natural choke point that opened up into a wide bowl where the Apache wickiup stood. "Quiet now," Doyle ordered, raising a gloved hand. "We catch them sleeping." The soldiers dismounted, carbines ready. Luke's men pulled bandanas over their faces, their eyes hard and eager. They crept forward, The only sound the crunch of boots on gravel. They crested the rise that overlooked the camp. "Fire at will," Doyle shouted. A volley of gunshots tore through the morning silence. Bullets ripped through the hide walls of the wickiups. Dust exploded. Birds screamed into the sky, but there were no screams from the camp. No bodies fell, no warriors ran out. "Cease fire," Doyle yelled. Confusion coloring his tone. The smoke drifted away. The camp was silent. The wickiups were there, but as the soldiers rushed down the slope, slashing open the entrances, they found them empty. Not just empty of people, but stripped of life. No cooking pots, no blankets, just the bare frames and the skins. "It is a ghost town," a soldier muttered. Luke rode down into the bowl, his face turning a mottled purple. "Where are they? They were here yesterday? My scouts saw them." Clara sat on her horse on the ridge, looking down at the confusion. She felt a surge of triumph so sharp it almost hurt. Nantan had moved the families. He had cleared the board. "It is a trap," Doyle said, spinning around, his eyes scanning the high walls of the canyon. "We are in a kill box," before the panic could fully take hold. Clara kicked her horse forward. She did not ride away. She rode down the slope, right into the center of the chaotic formation. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice cracking with the force of her desperation. "Stop this madness!" Clara Luke roared, spurring his horse toward her. "Get back! It is not safe! There is no one here to kill!" Luke, Clara shouted, turning her horse to face the soldiers. "To face Captain Doyle! Because they knew you were coming!" She looked at Doyle, her eyes blazing. "There are no renegades here. Captain, the only criminals in this valley are standing right next to you." "What is she talking about?" Doyle demanded, looking from Clara to Luke. "She is hysterical," Luke snarled, reaching for Clara's reins. "The shock has turned her mind." "Get her out of here, I am not hysterical," Clara yelled, pulling her horse away. "I am telling the truth. The wagon raids were not Apache. They were white men. I heard Luke planning it. I heard him tell you to plant evidence." A stunned silence fell over the canyon. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. "She is lying," Luke hissed, his hand dropping to the heavy revolver at his hip. "She has been brainwashed by that savage." Suddenly, a voice echoed from the rim of the canyon, seemingly coming from everywhere and nowhere. "The girl speaks the truth." Every head snapped up, standing on the highest pinnacle of the eastern wall. Silhouetted against the rising sun was Nantan. He stood tall, his rifle held loosely in one hand, his long hair moving in the wind. He looked not like a man, but like a spirit of the land itself. Behind him, along the rim, a line of Apache warriors rose from the rocks. They had bows drawn and rifles leveled. They had the high ground. They had the army surrounded. Luke Caro Nantan shouted. His voice was thunder in the enclosed space. "You wear the skin of the wolf, but you have the heart of a coyote." Nantan swung his arm, throwing a heavy burlap sack down into the canyon floor. It landed with a dull thud at the feet of Captain Doyle's horse. The sack split open. Out spilled a collection of items that damned Luke Caro to hell. There were moccasins with falsified soles designed to leave Apache tracks. There were wigs of black horsehair. There were war paints, and, most damning of all, a ledger book with the distinct seal of the Union Pacific Railroad. "Look at the tools of your trade," Nantan called out. "Look at the blood money." Doyle stared at the items. He looked at the ledger. He looked at Luke. "Is this true?" Doyle asked, his voice low and dangerous. Luke's face twisted. It was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He realized the walls were closing in. The game was up. The land, the wealth, the power, it was all dissolving like smoke. He did not answer Doyle. Instead, he drew his revolver with blinding speed. But he did not aim at Nantan on the ridge. The shot was too far. He aimed at the only vulnerability he could reach. He aimed at Clara. "If I cannot have it, no one will!" Luke screamed. The crack of the gunshot was simultaneous with the sound of Nantan's rifle from the ridge. Luke's bullet went wide, kicking up dirt inches from Clara's horse. as Nantan's shot struck the ground near Luke's stallion, causing the beast to rear violently. Luke was thrown from the saddle, landing hard in the dust. He scrambled to his feet, wild-eyed, and sprinted not toward the soldiers, but toward a narrow goat path that led up the canyon wall. He was running for the high ground, running to escape the judgment of the valley. "Stop him!" Doyle shouted. But Nantan was already moving. He slid down the steep scree of the canyon wall, moving with the controlled avalanche of a rock slide. He hit the canyon floor running, dropping his rifle and drawing his knife. Luke saw him coming. He turned, firing his revolver wildly. One shot hit Nantan in the leg, spinning him around, but the Apache warrior did not fall. He roared, a sound of pure primal fury, and tackled Luke as he tried to scramble up the rock face. The two men crashed into the red dust. It was a brawl of teeth and fists and steel. Luke was larger, heavier, fighting with the desperation of a cornered rat. Nantan was wounded, bleeding from his old shoulder wound and the new graze on his leg. But he fought with the cold precision of justice. They rolled toward the edge of a deep drop-off, a fissure in the canyon floor where the rainwaters drained into the dark earth below. Clara watched, horror gripping her throat. She saw Luke land a heavy blow to Nantan's head with the butt of his empty gun. Nantan crumpled. Luke stood over him, panting, blood streaming from his nose. He raised the gun to bring it down one final, crushing time on Nantan's skull. No, Clara did not think. She did not weigh the options. She vaulted from her horse and ran. She ran across the rocky ground, her dress tearing on the thorns. As Luke brought the gun down, Clara slammed into him with the full force of her body. It was not a blow of strength, but of surprise. Luke stumbled sideways, his boots skidding on the loose gravel near the edge of the fissure. He flailed, his arms windmills of panic. Clara fell back, landing hard on the ground. She looked up to see Luke teetering on the precipice. "Help me!" Luke screamed, his eyes locking onto hers. Clara. For a second, time stretched. Clara saw the man her father wanted her to marry. She saw the man who would have made her a prisoner in her own home. She saw the murderer. She did not reach for him. "You chose your path." "Luke," she whispered. Nantan, shaking the dizziness from his head, lunged forward. He did not strike. He grabbed Clara and pulled her back, away from the crumbling edge. The ground beneath Luke's feet gave way. There was a crumbling sound, a gasp, and then a long, fading scream as Luke Caro fell into the darkness of the earth he had tried so violently to possess. Silence slammed back into the canyon. Clara lay in the dust, her chest heaving. Nantan knelt beside her. He did not look at the edge where his enemy had fallen. He looked only at her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. Clara shook her head. She was trembling uncontrollably. "No, I am finished running." Doyle and the soldiers rode up, guns drawn but pointed at the ground. The warriors on the ridge kept their weapons trained on the soldiers. It was a standoff, a fragile moment where the massacre could still happen. Doyle looked at the fissure, then at Nantan, then at Clara. He dismounted slowly. He walked over to the burlap sack and picked up the ledger. He opened it, reading the entries written in Luke's handwriting. Payments for actors, payments for whiskey for the braves. He closed the book with a snap. "Stand down." Doyle ordered his men, but Captain A.A. Lieutenant protested. "That is Nantan. The renegade, I said stand down," Doyle roared. He looked at Nantan. "There has been enough lying in this valley." He looked at Clara. "You are a brave woman. Miss Beaumont, you stopped a war today." Clara stood up, Nantan's hand supporting her elbow. She looked at her father, who had ridden up and was staring at the empty space where Luke had been. Henry Beaumont looked old and broken, a man who had sold his soul for a fortune that just fell off a cliff. "I did not do it for you, Captain," Clara said, her voice steady. "And I did not do it for the town. I did it for the truth." She turned to the men of Silver Mesa, the men who had called her a victim, a prize, a porcelain doll. "Go home," she told them. "Go home and tell your wives that the Apache did not kill your sons. Tell them greed killed them. The ride back to town was a funeral procession for an era. The soldiers rode in silence. The body of Luke Caro was not recovered. The fissure was too deep. The earth had swallowed him whole. Clara did not ride with her father. She walked her horse beside Nantan, who walked despite his limp. The soldiers let them be, an unspoken truce holding the line. When they reached the edge of the town, the citizens came out. They saw the army returning without prisoners. They saw the proud Apache warrior walking unchained, and they saw Clara Beaumont, dusty, bruised, walking beside him not as a captive, but as an equal. A woman spat on the ground as Clara passed. "Traitor," she hissed. "You sided with the savages against your own kind." Clara stopped. She looked at the woman. "My kind," Clara asked. "If my kind are liars and murderers, then I am glad to be a traitor." But then an old man stepped off the boardwalk. He was the father of one of the wagon drivers who had been killed 2 weeks prior. He took off his hat. "Thank you, Miss Beaumont," he said, his voice cracking. "If what the captain says is true, if Luke killed my boy to start a war, then you gave my son justice." Clara nodded to him. Tears finally spilled over her lashes, tracking through the red dust on her cheeks. Nantan leaned close to her. "Do you see?" he murmured. "The walls are cracking." Clara looked up at him. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her exhausted, but beneath the fatigue was a core of steel she had forged in the fire of the canyon. "I see," she said. The climax was over. The guns were silent, but as Clara looked at the setting sun, she knew the hardest part was yet to come. The war of bullets had ended, but the war of hearts and the struggle to build a life from the wreckage was just beginning. The dust from the canyon had settled, but the silence that followed in Silver Mesa was louder than the gunfire had ever been. It was the silence of a town holding its breath, waiting for a judgment that had shifted from the barrel of a gun to the ink of a ledger. In the days following the confrontation at Echo Canyon, the machinery of civilization began to turn, grinding up the reputation of Luke Caro and spitting out the truth. Captain Doyle sat in his office, the walls lined with maps that were now obsolete. Across from him sat 2 men in expensive pinstripe suits, representatives from the Union Pacific Railroad who had arrived on the morning stagecoach. They did not look like men who belonged in the dust. They looked like sharks swimming in shallow water. "We were unaware of Mr. Caro's methods," one of the men said, smoothing his silk tie. "The company does not condone the incitement of war for land acquisition. It is bad for share prices." Doyle pushed the ledger across the desk. It was the book Nantan had thrown down from the cliff, the damning evidence of Luke's treachery. "It is all there," Doyle said, his voice tired. "The payments to the men who burned the wagons, the bribes to the supply officers." Luke Caro was not just buying land. He was manufacturing a crisis. The railroad men exchanged a look. There was no grief for Luke, only a cold calculation of liability. "We will conduct an internal audit," the second man said. "Anyone in the company found to have colluded with Caro will be dismissed. We will distance ourselves from this unpleasantness. As for the Apache," Doyle leaned forward. "As for the Apache, I have sent a report to the Department of the Interior. I stated that the hostilities were provoked by local criminal elements. I have recommended a suspension of all military operations against Nantan's band pending a formal treaty council." The town of Silver Mesa watched these proceedings with a mixture of shame and relief. The realization that they had been played for fools by Luke Caro was a bitter pill to swallow. The men who had been ready to slaughter a village now looked at their hands and wondered if they were patriots or merely puppets. At the Beaumont Ranch, the atmosphere was suffocating. The house, once filled with the confident bluster of Henry Beaumont and the smooth lies of Luke, now felt like a mausoleum. The servants moved quietly. Avoiding eye contact, Henry Beaumont spent his days in the study, a glass of whiskey constantly at his elbow. He was a man whose world had shattered. For 20 years, he had built his identity on being a patriarch, a leader, a man who knew what was best for his land and his daughter. In one afternoon, he had been exposed as a gullible old man who had nearly sold his only child to a monster. The shame was a corrosive acid. And like many proud men, Henry found it easier to transmute that shame into anger. It was on the third evening that the storm finally broke inside the house. Clara came down to dinner, dressed in a simple gray gown. She took her seat at the long mahogany table. The empty chair where Luke used to sit seemed to mock them. Henry slammed his glass down. The sound echoed in the high-ceilinged room. "Are you proud of yourself?" he asked, his voice thick with drink. Clara looked up, her spoon hovering over her soup. "I beg your pardon. Father, you have ruined us," Henry said, his face flushing red. "You paraded yourself in front of the whole town with that savage. You humiliated me. You humiliated the memory of your mother." Clara placed her spoon down gently. She did not tremble. The fear she used to feel in his presence had evaporated in the heat of the canyon. "I saved you." "Father," she said calmly, "I saved you from becoming an accessory to mass murder. And I saved myself from marrying a man who would have killed me the moment I became inconvenient." Henry stood up, swaying slightly. "You are a Beaumont. You have a duty to this family now, because of your stunt. No decent man in the territory will look at you. You are damaged goods. Clara, they whisper that you are the Indians' woman." Clara stood up as well. She was smaller than him. But in that moment, she seemed to tower over the broken man at the head of the table. "I would rather be the woman of an honest Apache than the wife of a white liar," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. "And if being decent means closing my eyes to slaughter so we can have more grazing land, then I want nothing to do with decency." Henry stared at her, his mouth opening and closing. He had expected tears. He had expected an apology. He had expected the obedient daughter who embroidered pillows and played the piano. That girl was gone. "Get out of my sight," Henry whispered, sinking back into his chair. Clara turned and walked out of the dining room. She did not run to her bedroom to cry. She went to the front porch and sat on the swing, looking out at the stars. She accepted the estrangement. It was the price of her soul, and she paid it willingly. Over the next week, the ice began to thaw in Silver Mesa. It started slowly. A few ranch wives, women who had lost sons or husbands in previous conflicts, came to Clara at the general store. They did not embrace her, but they nodded. One woman, whose brother had been a driver on the wagon train Luke attacked, squeezed Clara's hand. "You did right, girl," the woman murmured. "The truth has a way of coming out, even if it hurts." Then, the trade began. Nantan did not disappear into the mountains. He understood that isolation made them vulnerable. He sent a small party of warriors to the edge of town, not with weapons, but with goods finely tanned buckskin, baskets woven from river reeds, and medicinal herbs. It was a test. The shopkeeper, a man named Silas, not the foreman, but a cousin, hesitated, but greed and curiosity won out. He traded sacks of flour and coffee for the hides. The transaction was peaceful. No shots were fired. No insults were exchanged. It was a crack in the wall of hatred. One afternoon, a message came for Clara. It was not a letter, but a small boy from the town who ran up to the ranch gate. "Miss Clara, the man is there, the one with the long hair. He says he waits by the old cottonwood tree." Clara's heart leaped. She saddled Rusty herself, ignoring the dark looks from the ranch hands. She rode out to the edge of town, to the solitary cottonwood that marked the boundary between the settlement and the wild. Nantan was there. He was standing beside his paint horse, watching the horizon. He wore a clean shirt of bleached doe skin, and the bandage was gone from his shoulder, though she knew the scar would remain. When he saw her, his face softened. The guarded look of the warrior dropped away, revealing the man beneath. "Clara," he said, "Nantan." They did not embrace. They were in open view of the town, and the peace was too fragile to test with such a display. But the air between them vibrated with a connection that needed no touch. "You look tired," Nantan said, studying her face. "The war inside the house is harder than the war in the canyon," Clara admitted. "My father, he cannot forgive me for being right. He is a man of pride," Nantan said. "Pride is a heavy shield. It is hard to put down." "How is your shoulder?" Clara asked. "It heals. The skin knits together. But the tribe, we are wary. The soldiers have stopped patrolling, but we know the winter is coming, and the railroad is still hungry. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. That is why I asked you to come. I am going back to the deep mountains, to the winter grounds. It is a place few white eyes have seen. Are you leaving for good? Clara asked, a spike of panic piercing her chest. No, Nantan said. I'm going to prepare my people, but I want you to see it. See who we are when we are not running. See the life you saved. Nantan looked deep into her eyes. You have seen the blood. Clara, now I want you to see the heart. Come with me, not as a captive, as a guest, as my friend. Clara looked back toward the ranch house, a speck in the distance. It was a comfortable prison. Then she looked at the mountains, purple and majestic against the sky. When she asked, "Tomorrow at sunrise," Nantan replied, "We ride past the lake." That evening, the silence at the Beaumont Ranch was broken not by shouting, but by a knock on Clara's door. "Come in," she said, expecting a servant. It was Henry. He looked sober for the first time in days. He had shaved, and he wore a clean suit, though it hung loosely on his frame. He stood in the doorway, looking at his daughter as if seeing her for the first time. "May I come in?" he asked. Clara nodded, turning from the window. Henry walked into the room and sat on the edge of the velvet chair. He clasped his hands together, his knuckles white. "I rode into town today," he said quietly. "I spoke to Dr. Thompson, and I spoke to the banker." Clara waited. "They told me that the town is quiet. They told me that the fear is gone." Henry looked down at the floor. "They told me that my daughter has more courage in her little finger than the entire town council had in their collective bodies." He took a shaky breath. "I walked past the church. I saw the grave of Luke's father, and I thought about Luke. I thought about how charming he was, how sensible his plans sounded. And then I remembered the look on his face when he tried to pull you off that cliff." He looked up at Clara, and his eyes were wet. "I was ready to trade you for a railroad contract. Clara, I told myself it was for your security, but it was for my vanity. I wanted to be the king of the valley, and I was willing to make you the price of the crown." "Father." Clara started, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish. I am a stubborn old bull. Clara, but I am not blind. I saw you stand between two armies. I saw you save a man who should have been your enemy because it was the right thing to do." He stood up and walked over to her. He reached out, his hand hovering, then gently touched her shoulder. "I'm sorry. Clara, I am so profoundly sorry. I failed you as a father, and I failed this land as a steward." Clara looked at him. The anger she had held on to melted, replaced by a deep sadness. She saw the man he could be, the man he used to be before the greed of the frontier hardened him. "I forgive you, Father," she said softly. Henry let out a breath, a sound like a dam breaking. "Thank you, but," Clara continued, her voice firming, "I cannot go back to how things were. I am not the girl who sits in the parlor and waits for a husband. I cannot be that doll anymore." "I know," Henry said. "I would not expect you to be. If you want to be my father, really my father," Clara said, "then you have to help me fix this. Not just with words, with action." "What do you want me to do?" Henry asked. "Support the treaty." Clara said, "Use your influence. Tell the governor. Tell the railroad that the Beaumont Ranch stands with the Apache, that we recognize their right to the land. If Henry Beaumont says it, others will follow." Henry hesitated. It was a political suicide in some circles. It went against everything his generation believed about manifest destiny. But he looked at his daughter, at the steel in her spine, and he knew it was the only way to keep her. "It will be hard," Henry said. "People will call me a turncoat." "Let them," Clara said. "Better a turncoat than a grave robber." Henry nodded slowly. He extended his hand. "Very well. I will ride to Tucson next week. I will speak to the governor." Clara took his hand. It was a pact, a new beginning built on the ashes of the old. "I am going away for a few days," Clara said then. Henry stiffened. "With him?" "Yes," Clara said. He has invited me to see his village, as a guest." Henry looked out the window toward the darkening mountains. A week ago, he would have locked her in her room. Now, he simply sighed. "Will you come back?" he asked. "Yes," Clara said. "I will come back. But I need to see the other side of the fence." Henry nodded. "Be careful." "Clara, the mountains are indifferent to who you are." "I know." She smiled. "That is why I love them." The next morning, the sun was a disk of molten gold when Clara met Nantan. She carried a saddlebag with a few clothes and a notebook. She told her father she was going to document the truth of the Apache people, to write a story that might change minds in the East. It was true, but it was not the whole truth. They rode out of Silver Mesa side by side. The town was waking up, smoke rising from chimneys. A few people stopped to watch them go. There were whispers. Yes, but there were no shouts. The spectacle had become a reality. They rode west, retracing the path of their desperate flight weeks ago. But the urgency was gone. They let the horses walk. They spoke of small things, the rain that was due, the hawk circling overhead, the way the cactus bloomed in the night. By midday, they reached the entrance to the hidden canyon. The red rocks towered above them, silent sentinels of their history. They rode down to the lake. It was just as Clara remembered it, yet entirely different. When she had first come here, it was a place to hide. When she had come here with Nantan the first time, it was a place of desperation and blood. Now, under the bright noon sun, the lake was a jewel of turquoise and sapphire. The water was calm. The willows were turning gold with the season. Nantan stopped his horse. He looked at the water, then at Clara. "This is where you found me." He said, "This is where we found each other." Clara corrected him gently. She looked at the rock where he had bled. She looked at the spot where she had bathed in the moonlight, where he had promised that her first night belonged to her. She realized that the first night was not just a moment in time. It was a state of being. It was the moment she stepped out of the shadow of others' expectations and into the light of her own choices. "We should water the horses," Nantan said, breaking the spell. They dismounted. Clara walked to the water's edge. She dipped her hand in. It was cold, refreshing. "Do you remember what you said?" Clara asked, looking up at him. "That my first night is mine, I remember," Nantan said, his eyes dark and warm. Clara stood up. She wiped her wet hand on her riding skirt. "I am not running anymore." "Nantan," she said, "I am riding toward something. I do not know exactly what it is yet, but I know I am not afraid." Nantan smiled, a rare, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "That is good. Clara Beaumont, because the path ahead is steep, and the view from the top, it changes everything." He offered her a leg up onto her horse. His hands lingered on her waist for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "Come," he said. "My people wait, and tonight we will sit by a fire that is not hidden." They turned their horses away from the lake, riding up the trail that led deeper into the mountains. The falling action was complete. The debris of the climax had been cleared away. What lay ahead was the resolution, the building of a new house, a new understanding, and a love that had earned the right to exist in the open air, behind them. The lake rippled in the breeze, holding its secrets, a silent witness to the girl who became a woman, and the enemy who became a partner. The weeks that followed Clara Beaumont's departure from Silver Mesa were not measured in hours or minutes, but in the rising of the sun and the lengthening of shadows across the red earth. She had ridden into the high mountains, into the heart of the Apache winter grounds, leaving behind the corset of civilization for a life that was raw, demanding, and profoundly honest. The village was nestled in a box canyon, protected from the biting winds that signaled the approach of winter. Here, life was a rhythm that Clara had to learn from scratch. She was no longer the rancher's daughter who rang a bell for tea. She was a woman who had to learn how to find the root of the yucca plant for soap, how to grind acorns into flour until her arms ached, and how to sit in silence without feeling the need to fill it with idle chatter. The women of the tribe watched her closely at first. They tested her resolve. They gave her the hardest tasks, the ones that broke fingernails and calloused palms. Clara did not complain. She scrubbed the cooking pots with river sand. She hauled water until her shoulders screamed, and slowly, the suspicion in their eyes turned to acceptance. One afternoon, an elder woman named Little Crow sat beside Clara as she struggled with a loom. Clara's fingers were clumsy with the dyed wool, the patterns refusing to emerge. Little Crow laughed, a dry, crackling sound like dry leaves, and gently moved Clara's hands. "You fight the thread," Little Crow said in broken English. "Do not fight. The wool knows where it wants to go. You must listen to it. Just as you must listen to the land." Clara realized then that freedom was not the absence of rules. It was not doing whatever she pleased. Freedom was understanding her place in the great web of life. It was knowing that if she did not gather wood, the fire would die. If she did not weave, her family would be cold. It was a freedom born of responsibility, not entitlement. In the evenings, Nantan would return from hunting or patrolling the perimeter. He would sit by her fire, tired and smelling of the pine forest. They did not speak much of the war or of Luke Caro. Those ghosts belonged to the valley below. Instead, they spoke of the mountains. One night, the moon was a sliver of ice in the black sky. The camp was quiet. Nantan poked the fire with a stick, sending sparks swirling up toward the stars. "My father built this fire pit," Nantan said softly. "He was a man who laughed often. He told me that laughter is the only thing that scares the darkness away." Clara looked at him. He rarely spoke of his family. "Where are they now?" she asked, though she feared the answer. Nantan stared into the flames. 10 years ago, the blue coats came. Not Doyle, a different man. A man who wanted medals. He attacked our summer camp near the Gila River. He said we had stolen horses. We had not. He paused, his jaw tightening. My father walked out to talk to them. He held up a white cloth. They shot him before he could speak. My mother ran to him. They shot her too, and my sister, she was small. She hid in the basket. They burned the wiki up. Clara felt a cold hand squeeze her heart. The brutality of it was suffocating. She reached out and touched his arm. "I swore then," Nantan continued, his voice void of emotion, which made it all the more terrifying. "I swore I would never trust a white face again. I swore that every one of you was a liar and a killer. I became the ghost they feared. I let the hate keep me warm." He turned his head slowly to look at her. His eyes were dark pools reflecting the firelight. "Then I went to the lake, and I saw a girl who put her hands in my blood to save me. A girl who looked at me not as a savage, but as a man in pain." Clara held his gaze. "I saw a man who protected me when he could have used me." She whispered, "You broke my oath." "Clara," Nantan said, "you broke the hate, and that terrified me more than the bullets. Because if I could not hate you, I had to feel again. And feeling is a dangerous thing for a warrior." Clara moved closer to him. The space between them, once a chasm of culture and history, had narrowed to the width of a heartbeat. "It is dangerous," she agreed. "But it is the only thing that makes us more than just survivors." A week later, a rider approached the canyon entrance. It was not a soldier, but a solitary messenger from the trading post. An old Mexican man who knew the trails better than anyone. He carried a letter wrapped in oilskin. It was for Clara. She sat on a fallen log near the stream to read it. The handwriting was familiar, looping and heavy. Her father's hand. "My dearest Clara, the governor has listened. It was not easy, and I have lost friends in the Cattlemen's Association. But the treaty is being drafted. The Eastern Valley will be designated as protected land. The railroad has agreed to route the tracks south, through the flats. It will cost them more, but with the scandal of Caro exposed, they have no stomach for a fight. The house is quiet without you. The piano sits covered in dust. I walk past your room every night and wish I could hear you reading aloud. I know you have found a path that I do not fully understand, but know this, the door is unlocked. If you ever tire of the wind and the hard ground, your home is here. Not as a prison, but as a sanctuary. I will not ask you to marry. I will not ask you to be anything other than my daughter. With love and regret, Henry. Clara lowered the letter. Tears pricked her eyes. He had done it. He had actually done it. He had stood up for the Apache, for her, and for his own soul. Nantan approached her. He saw the paper in her hand. He knew what it was. Your father calls you home, he stated. Clara looked at the letter, then at the village. She looked at the women grinding corn, the children playing kickball, the smoke rising against the blue sky. Then she looked at Nantan. He calls me back to a life of ease, she said. He offers me a soft bed, servants, and safety. He says I do not have to marry. I can be the spinster of Silver Mesa, living in the big house, playing the piano for guests. It is a good life, Nantan said. His face was unreadable. It is the life you were born for. You will be warm in the winter. You will be safe. Clara stood up. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her pocket. Yes, she said, it is a good life, but it is not my life. Not anymore. She walked over to Nantan. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he was preparing himself to let her go. I was born in a house with thick walls, Clara said, but I was reborn in a canyon with no roof. I cannot go back to sleeping inside. Nantan, I cannot go back to wearing shoes that pinch my feet and corsets that stop me from breathing. Nantan let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for hours. You choose the hard path, I choose the path that has you on it, Clara said simply. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the western peaks, turning the sky into a canvas of bruised purple and burning orange, Nantan asked Clara to walk with him. They climbed the ridge that overlooked the valley. From this height, the world seemed vast and endless. To the south lay the distant haze of Silver Mesa. To the west, the endless spine of the mountains. Below them, the village was a collection of small sparks in the gathering dusk. Nantan stopped near a twisted juniper tree. He turned to face her. He took off his hat, holding it in his hands. He looked vulnerable in a way she had never seen. Clara, he began, his voice low, I have no gold to give you. I have no herds of cattle. I cannot promise you that we will not be hungry when the snow is deep. I cannot promise you that the world will not try to break us again. He looked down at his hands, then up at her face. I am a man of the earth. I have the wind that blows through the canyon. I have the fire that burns in the winter. And I have a promise. He stepped closer, his dark eyes locking onto hers. I promise that I will stand between you and the storm. I promise that as long as I draw breath, you will never be sold. You will never be owned. And you will never be alone. He reached out and took her hand. His palm was rough, warm, and real. Will you walk this path with me? Will you be my wife? Clara looked at him. She thought of Luke Caro with his silk vests and his cold eyes. She thought of the empty promises of society. And then she looked at Nantan, a man who offered her nothing but his entire soul. I do not want a big house. Nantan, she whispered. I want a home. And you are my home. She squeezed his hand. Yes, I will walk with you. Nantan did not shout. He did not spin her around. He simply bowed his head and pressed his forehead against hers. It was a gesture of profound intimacy, a sharing of breath and spirit. The wedding was simple. 2 days later, under the gaze of the elders, they exchanged vows. There was no priest, no organ music, just the words spoken in the Apache tongue and in English, binding them together before the sky and the earth. That night, Nantan led her away from the village, back to a small shelter he had built near a high spring. It was secluded, quiet, surrounded by aspen trees that whispered in the wind. A fire was already burning. They sat beside it on a bed of furs. Nantan looked at her. The firelight danced on his face, softening the sharp angles. Do you remember the lake? He asked. Clara nodded. I remember. You said my first night was mine. Nantan reached out and gently touched her cheek. You were a girl then, afraid, running. And now Clara asked, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. Now you are a woman who has chosen her own name, Nantan said. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not the desperate, stolen contact of a fugitive. It was the slow, deep kiss of a husband. It tasted of smoke and promise. Clara closed her eyes, melting into him. She felt the rough texture of his shirt, the strength of his arms around her. She felt the last vestiges of the Miss Beaumont she had been fall away like dry leaves. The phrase, "Your first night is mine," echoed in her memory, but its meaning had shifted completely. It was no longer a claim of protection over a stranger. It was a gift. She was giving this night, this first true night of her life, to him, and he was giving it back to her, moment by moment, touch by touch. There were no walls to contain them. The ceiling was a tapestry of 1,000,000 stars. The wind moved through the trees, a soft applause for the union of two souls who had crossed a river of blood to find each other. The fire burned low, turning to glowing embers, and the night embraced them. It was a night of tenderness, of discovery, and of a freedom so absolute that it felt like flying. 5 years later. The trading post stood near the entrance to the hidden canyon, not far from the lake. It was a sturdy structure of stone and timber, built to last. A sign hung above the door, carved in wood, "Two Worlds Trading." Inside, the shelves were stocked with goods from both sides of the divide. There were woven baskets and intricate beadwork from the Apache women, sitting next to sacks of coffee and bolts of calico cloth from the town. Clara stood behind the counter, measuring out sugar for a ranch hand. She wore a dress of durable cotton, but around her neck hung a necklace of turquoise and silver. Her hair was braided in the Apache style, but her face still held the soft features of the Beaumont line, now etched with the fine lines of laughter and sun. "Thank you, Tom," she said, handing the sack to the man. "Say hello to your wife for me." "I will, Mrs." "Ah, Clara," the man stammered. He still did not know quite what to call her. She was a legend in the territory. The woman who walked between worlds. Outside, in the shade of the porch, a group of children sat in a circle. Some were Apache, with dark hair and quick eyes. Some were white, the children of settlers. They were all looking at a chalkboard. "And this letter is A," a deep voice said. "A is for apple, and A is for arrow." Nantan stood by the board. He had filled out, his shoulders broader, his presence more grounded. He was no longer the hunted renegade. He was a bridge builder. He taught the children of both bloods, teaching them that the world was big enough for both English words and Apache stories. A little girl, Clara's daughter, ran up to him. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's smile. "Father, look, I drew the lake." Nantan picked her up, swinging her into the air. "It is beautiful. Little star, just like the real one." Clara walked out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She leaned against the doorframe, watching them. The fear that had once defined this land had not vanished completely. There were still hard men and narrow minds, but here, in this circle of shade, it had been replaced by something stronger. Henry Beaumont rode up to the post once a month. He would sit on the porch with Nantan, smoking a pipe, talking about the weather and the cattle prices. They were not friends, perhaps, but they were family. They shared a respect born of survival and the love of the same woman. That evening, after the post was closed and the children were asleep, Clara and Nantan walked down to the lake. The water was still, reflecting the first stars of the evening. It was the same lake where a terrified girl had once washed her feet and found a bleeding warrior. It was the crucible where their lives had melted down and fused together. Nantan put his arm around Clara's waist. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "It is quiet tonight," she said. "The land is resting," Nantan replied. Clara looked at her reflection in the water. She saw a woman who was whole. She saw a woman who had traded a cage of gold for a life of stone and sky, and who had come out the winner. "Do you ever miss it?" Nantan asked suddenly. "The ease," Clara laughed softly. "I miss hot baths sometimes, but then I remember the cold water of this lake, and I remember that the cold makes you feel alive." She turned to him, placing her hand on his chest, over the scar that she had bandaged so many years ago. "I would not trade 1 hour of this life for 100 years of that one," she said. Nantan kissed her forehead. The Wild West was still wild. There were still storms. There were still droughts. But for the first time in the history of the territory, there was a place where the storm did not break the people. Clara looked out across the water. The wind whispered through the reeds, carrying the scent of sage and rain. It was the voice of the land, and it no longer whispered of danger. It whispered of home. The journey was over. The girl who ran away had stopped running, not because she was caught, but because she had found the only place worth standing still for, in the place where the water reflected both the heaven and the earth. She had chosen her house, and the door was always open. Thank you so much for listening to the story, She Was a Virgin Alone at the Lake. I hope you enjoyed this journey through the red rocks and the human heart. I would love to hear from you in the comments section below. Where are you listening from? What did you think of Clara's choice? Please share your thoughts and let's get a conversation going. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Don't forget to hit the like button and smash that hype button to help this story reach more listeners. Your support means the world to me and helps keep these stories of the frontier alive. Thank you, and see you on the next trail.